Okay, this is the second lecture about Miller's 300, and as you'll see, I've got 6 points here, which I will put up, ding, and you will see them for your very self. And the first one is remythologizing the hot gates. And to remythologize something is to reframe, it's pretty much what it sounds, is to take something which had a different meaning, sort of, and translate it into the current moment so that you want to explain something in a way where it's like nobody understood it then. So you want to explain how it can somebody be not understood now. It's sort of like magic. An example that one of my profs used to use, which was quite good, if you didn't know the technology, it was quite good, was that he was a religious scholar. So he would say, Jesus was faxed to us, which is kind of nice. Because basically it's like, who understands fax machines? Well, actually, they're quite easy to understand. But in the same, it's sort of like saying, well, Jesus was texted to us. It's like, well, how does a text actually work? Exactly. Like, show me, what happens from you putting it, that kind of thing. That's remythologizing. So to take the idea of the hot gates, which meant something to people listening to Greeks, basically, Greek storytellers, Athenian storytellers, in the 5th century BC, or 4th century BCE, and make it mean something now is a huge act, basically, of what we would call remythologization. Okay, that's the long explanation. So here is what we know about the events of the narrow pass called Thermopylae, the hot gates, and it can be helpful to see the actual land itself. So I'll show you some images of here's the Gulf of Malea, and you'll see the Phoenician wall on the left side. This is sort of a classic map looking down. And it's a topographical map, so the little lines, the little shaded lines indicate mountains, basically. And then so Mount Kalidromos is running water, and so on. And you'll see Thermopylae, the little arrow pointing to Thermopylae, and the mound. So you can see how close that little dotted line, which is the pass, that's the pathway that the Persians were expecting to use, and it goes right beside the ocean, right? And then the two blue, the blue and white maps with the red, you'll see where it is in Greece, and then a little inset map, and then you'll see the top map is the mass of blue dots is the Persians. And the red dots, the few red dots, are the Spartans holding at the gate, right? And the reason you can hold people is that you're right up against the ocean. You've got the ocean on one side, mountains on the other. That's why it's basically this little ledge of stone, right, beside the mountains. Okay. And then in the bottom picture on in this slide, you'll see of the blue slides, you'll see the little little end run where four little blue dots come around, and they're met by two little red dots. So that's where the Spartans divide their force and leave most of the squad at the hot gates themselves. Hot gates, Thermopylae, Thermopylae, or Pylae. Okay, here is another example of it, which is even more blunt, which changes the color around. So this time the big force is the red force, which is the Persians. And you see them discovering the alternate route over Mount Kalidromos, the goat path, which was discovered to them. and they're flanking the Spartans. So they come around, and the Spartans retreat to the hill, and they're all killed. Okay, so this is very useful in terms of actually understanding. These days, if you went to Greece now to visit the site, which people do, I mean, it's a historic site, and people have heard the story and they want to see it. The ocean is actually a couple of miles out now because the ocean has retreated over the course of a couple of thousand years. And so now, essentially, it's inland. There is no narrow pass anymore. But that's okay. So let me go back here. So here is what we know about the events at this narrow pass, which was at the time Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, in northern Greece in August of 480 BCE. The Spartan king Leonidas, with 300 chosen Spartan soldiers, met the Persian king Xerxes, whose army numbered between 2 and 5 million men. Uncertain. For 4 days, Leonidas and 300 held the pass, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking Persians. Their losses were so grievous that Xerxes sought out another route over Mount Kallidromos, and the other path, the goat path, was discovered to him by a Greek trader named Ephialtes, not of Spartan, which we knew. He's not Spartan. Knowing he'd been betrayed and wouldn't survive a 5th day, Leonidas dismissed his Greek allies and fought the Persian horde to a standstill at the Hot Gates. Only when their flank was turned did the 300 Spartans retreat to a hillock, sometimes called the mound, right? Where, despite their heroism and skill, they were killed to a man. That is, none survived. The Greek poet Simonides commemorated the tragedy with his famous epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans, thou who passest by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Because of the Spartan example, the Greeks found the courage to face and defeat the Persian invaders at the battles of Salamis and Plataea, preserving the Athenian culture, which ultimately supplied the West, that's us, in North America, with its foundational notions of democracy, aesthetics, medicine, mathematics, and law. The Battle of Thermopylae has become a sign for heroism and loyalty, persistence in the face of overwhelming odds, and the acceptance of death for the nation or country or the state. We also know about these remarkable events primarily from the 5th century Greek author and often considered to be first historian, Herodotus, who wrote a book called Histories. The other considered to be first historian is Thucydides, and his book, The Peloponnesian War. While Herodotus wasn't at the Battle of Thermopylae, because he survived, right, he recorded oral and written accounts of it. So he went around and got accounts from people. We've also learned in his histories that Herodotus lied. So let's start again, right? For instance, he claimed to have traveled to places he probably never did. It's possible, I don't think it's likely, that he had tea as good as this. Eat your heart out, Herodotus. He probably was drinking some kind of grog. Although, actually, there's a nice... there's a plant that grows in Greece. I don't know the name of this. A friend of mine brought some for me. And it's called Greek Mountain Tea, and it's actually very nice. It's it sort of looks like chamomile, but it isn't. It's stronger than chamomile, but it's not quintessential. It's not a tea bush. Anyway, sidebar there for a little discussion about tea. So the thing about Herodotus, this historian, is he claimed to have traveled to places he probably never did. It's possible he wrote part of the histories in Sparta. So, in other words, it was a good, smart thing for him to do, to lionize the Spartans and make them look really good. We think, and this is all I'm drawing now on a bunch of historians who have gone over this territory. His calculation of the Persian horde was off by more than a factor of 10. So, what that means is that contemporary estimates, when we look back, because there's just no way you could have moved an army of 2 to 5 million people in the Bronze Age. No. It's like, nah, it's not going to happen. You couldn't supply them. You just couldn't. It's just not possible. So it's more likely that Xerxes' army strength was between 100,000 and 360,000, not 5 million. And that's still a huge number, but it's not 5 million, right? It's unlikely that the experienced mountain soldiers in the Persian army, for instance, fought in the past for 2 days before looking for another route. No. I mean, they see they're stuck, they start looking. There was no betrayal by Ephialtes of the alternate route that was known to the Persians. And this is now I'm quoting you from two different people, one of them who says, deliberately, the great secret about Thermopylae and the selling of the pass is that there was no secret. In other words, they just found the track and they were like, oh yeah, here we go. We knew there would be a track like this, and off they went. In many instances, Herodotus' sources don't corroborate his claims. This is a famous German book by a guy who looked at this stuff and said, nah. The time it took to write the history suggests that Herodotus told his stories orally to many different audiences. And so it's standard to tell a story in a town and then move over and tell the story again. And the thing about this is it's kind of like doing stand-up, where you get to be good at telling the story, and people are like, oh, we really like this part, and you know what audiences are going to like and what they're not going to like. And so knowing what they're going to like, you start to change the story so that you make them happier, right? This should sound familiar. It should sound like Tim O'Brien, where basically you have an eye on your audience and you want to keep them happy. And yeah, sure, you stay true to your original story to an extent, right? And so Herodotus would have altered stories as public orators did to please listeners. Although a great deal of the histories is not verifiable, so you can say, well, it's all junk. It's like, unfortunately, it's not all junk, because Herodotus cannot be dismissed as a completely unreliable source. And so now I'm quoting to you from the introduction, the Oxford introduction to their version of the histories. By the nature of the evidence, we can independently validate relatively little of what Herodotus tells us from the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. But it is also true that details culled from archaeology or the chance preservation of fragmentary written material often corroborates what Herodotus has told us. So we have a classic unreliable narrator. Some of it is true. It's the worst possible situation to be in. You can't take it all, and you can't take none of it. If you can take none of it, you say, oh, it's just junk, we'll throw it out. No, can't do that. So let's start again. All right. So here's a revised version of maybe what happened. Here's what we think we know about the events at Thermopylae in August of 480 BCE. The Spartan king Leonidas, with 300 chosen foot soldiers and perhaps 2,000 Greek allies, including hundreds of Spartan slaves, that you'll notice don't get any mention in Miller's book, met the Persian king Xerxes with his army numbering between 100,000 and 360,000 men. For 4 days, the Spartans and their allies held a pass. Stalled, Xerxes moved some troops into the well-known alternate route over Kallidromos. On the 4th day, the Persians turned the Greek flank, coming around, and killed Leonidas and all his men. Most of the rest of the Greek army retreated. Simonides wrote his epitaph. There were no 5 million against the 300. There was no secret pass. There was no Ephialtes. None of the above. Miller includes Ephialtes, leaves out the slaves, includes the Persian millions, exclude the others who died for Greece that day. Very interesting. In other words, he tells Dilios what kind of stories to spin, right? So it's not just Dilios who's telling the stories. Miller's telling a story. Yeah, it's a comic. Well, people say, well, it's a comic. It can't be real. It's like, or can't be accurate. But that's not true. We know from books like Mouse and everything Joe Sacco has done, which is an astonishing body of work. Footnotes in Gaza, Palestine, Safe Area Garashta. Most recently, the book about Indigenous Canadians. That he is meticulous about detail. He's a reporter, and it may be the medium may be comics, but that doesn't mean they're lies at all. So the story here is serving a purpose, and like just about every other text we're going to meet in 242, actually all the other texts we're going to meet in 242, it's a story about stories. It is about the uses of myth. It is about the way the different narrators in different times interpret the same fable for different purposes. It is about the way we as readers choose to interpret texts now, and the way, for instance, that, say, Vietnam was going to look at this event and say, what did this mean to us? And for an example of this, for instance, have a look at this little clip from this famous movie. It's not as famous as it should be, I think, but anyway, it's still famous. Okay, have a look at this.
You read French, Corporal?
Fairly well, sir. I think it refers to the Battle of Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans died trying to hold the pass. If you remember your Greek history, sir.
Yeah.
It says, roughly, stranger, when you find us lying here, go tell the Spartans we obeyed their orders.
You think there's 300 French buried here?
I'll count them first chance I get, sir.